The morning sun spilled through the diner's wide front windows, painting the checkered floor in soft gold. Mark sat in a red vinyl booth, his coffee steaming beside a plate of pancakes that his daughter, Sophie, was drowning in syrup. She giggled as she tried to cut them herself, the knife clinking against the plate. For Mark, these moments were everything: simple, unhurried, a small pocket of peace in a life that often felt like an uphill climb. It was mid-laughter when he first noticed her. Their waitress, Emily, moved briskly between tables, her apron slightly askew, a practiced smile fixed on her face. But something in her eyes didn't match that smile. They darted toward the counter, where a man sat nursing a mug of coffee, leaning forward just a little too far every time she passed. At first, Mark thought he was just a chatty regular. But then Emily's shoulders stiffened when the man spoke, and she gripped the coffee pot so tightly her knuckles turned white. Mark's gaze followed her as she placed a plate on another table. She laughed at something the man said, but it was too quick, too high-pitched, like laughter forced through a clenched jaw. Sophie kept talking about the weekend plans, but her father's focus was elsewhere now. He didn't know Emily, yet something in him, the same instinct that made him scan playgrounds for danger when Sophie was small, was stirring. It was subtle, but clear enough: something wasn't right. And the longer he watched, the more he felt he couldn't just ignore it. Mark tried to keep his attention on Sophie's excited chatter, but his eyes kept drifting back to Emily. The signs were stacking up, each one tightening the knot in his stomach. First, he saw her step back a half-inch every time the man at the counter leaned toward her, like she was trying to shrink herself out of reach. Second, her eyes flicked toward the kitchen door more often than toward the customers she served, as if she were searching for an escape route. The third sign was harder to miss: when the man's hand brushed hers as she set down his plate, she flinched, not dramatically, but enough for Mark to notice. Then came the fourth. Her voice had dropped so low he could barely hear it, the confident rhythm she'd used at their table now replaced by something quiet, almost shaky. Finally, the fifth sign came in the form of a brittle laugh. It didn't carry warmth, it was the kind of laugh people use when they're just trying to keep a situation from boiling over. Sophie followed her dad's gaze and frowned. She was too young to understand every detail, but she understood enough. "Daddy," she whispered, tugging his sleeve. She looked scared. That simple sentence landed like a stone in Mark's chest. He'd been hoping he was imagining it, that maybe it was just a bad day for the waitress. But now, hearing Sophie put words to what he was seeing, he knew it wasn't in his head. Something was wrong, and it wasn't going to stop on its own. Mark's mind began to race. He'd been in situations before where it was easier, safer, to just keep his head down and let someone else step in. But here, there was no someone else. The cook was busy in the back, other customers were buried in their breakfasts, and the man at the counter showed no sign of backing off. Mark took a sip of his coffee, trying to think it through. A part of him warned, "Don't cause a scene. You don't know the full story." But another voice, louder, sharper, reminded him of every talk he'd had with Sophie about doing the right thing, even when it's uncomfortable. He glanced at his daughter. She was still watching Emily, her little brow furrowed in concern. If he stayed silent, what lesson would that teach her? That you look away when someone's in trouble? That fear is stronger than kindness? No. That wasn't the example he wanted to set. Mark pushed his plate aside and stood, his heart thudding against his ribs. As he walked toward the counter, he caught Emily's eye. She seemed startled at first, then a flicker of relief passed over her face, as if she'd been silently hoping someone would intervene. "Hey, Emily," he said warmly, as though greeting an old friend. Then he turned to the man, his tone steady but firm. "She's busy working. Why don't you give her some space?" The diner fell into a brief, tense silence. Mark didn't know how the man would react, but he knew one thing: he wasn't going to sit back and do nothing. The man at the counter muttered something under his breath, his eyes narrowing, but after a beat, he slid his coffee mug away and stood up. He tossed a few bills on the counter, more out of irritation than generosity, and walked out, the bell over the door jingling in his wake. The tension that had been wound tight in the air seemed to snap, and Emily let out a slow, shaky exhale. She leaned against the counter for just a moment, like she finally had permission to breathe. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely above the hum of the diner's chatter returning. "No one's ever stepped in before. I thought I'd just have to deal with it." Mark gave her a small, reassuring smile. "No one should have to deal with that. Not ever." His tone wasn't heroic, it was matter of fact, the way you'd state something obvious, like the sky being blue. Sophie, still sitting at their booth, beckoned Emily over. The little girl tore her last pancake in half and slid one piece toward her on a napkin. "You can have some," she said earnestly. Emily blinked, caught off guard, then chuckled softly, the kind of laugh that carried real warmth this time. "Thank you, sweetheart," she said, taking the pancake like it was more than just food. Mark watched the exchange, realizing that in Sophie's simple gesture was the heart of it all. Kindness wasn't always loud or complicated. Sometimes it was as small as making someone feel safe enough to smile again. A few weeks later, Mark and Sophie found themselves back at the diner, slipping into the same red booth by the window. The smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, and the morning light streamed in just as it had before, but this time, there was no unease tugging at Mark's thoughts. Emily spotted them almost instantly. Her smile was different now, real, effortless, reaching all the way to her eyes. She came over with menus but no forced cheer, just the easy warmth of someone who felt safe in her own space. "Good to see you two again," she said, pouring their coffee and setting down Sophie's chocolate milk. As they chatted, Emily leaned in slightly. "I wanted to tell you, what you did that day, it meant more than you know. I told my manager about some of the things that have happened, and they're making changes. I don't think I would have spoken up if you hadn't reminded me I matter." Her voice wavered for just a second before she straightened with a smile. Mark felt a quiet swell of pride, but not for himself, for the fact that Sophie had witnessed the whole thing from beginning to end. She had seen that kindness wasn't just words, but action. As they left later that morning, Sophie slipped her hand into his. "Daddy," she said softly, "I think you made her braver." Mark smiled down at her. "Maybe," he said. "But you helped, too." And together, they stepped out into a world that suddenly felt just a little bit kinder.